Alright, so we have another article for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth today, this one focusing on the importance of bringing back that explorable world map that kind of went missing from some of the previous Final Fantasies throughout the years. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around, you can subscribe as well. It is always appreciated. So funny enough, I actually did talk very briefly about this in my deep dive video, but I cut it out because that video was just approaching way too long. I think it was like almost 25 minutes, and unfortunately something had to go in the editing process, and that was the world map talk. But thanks to today's article, we can revisit that and go a little bit more in depth with this world map situation. So this article comes to us from Game Informer, where they sat down with Tetsuya Nomura and Yoshinori Kitase to kind of talk about how that world map disappeared over the years and why they felt it was important to bring it back for Rebirth. One of the first things the article notes is that, of course, Final Fantasy 1 through 9 had these explorable open world map type things that you could run around, find new cities, new enemies, all that great stuff. But with the introduction of Final Fantasy X, that disappeared, and that game itself was incredibly linear. And I know when people hear the word linear, they tend to think of it as a four-letter word, as something really bad. But just because something is linear or wide linear, that doesn't mean it's bad. You can do linear in a way that works really well. And I think Final Fantasy X actually does linear really well, because essentially you're just going through these random hallways that are connecting you from story point to story point, getting from point A to point B. But it's how you get from point A to B in 10 that is very interesting. These areas that you're exploring are really beautiful. They're full of life and cool characters that you can run up and talk to. There are sections where you can go off the hidden path just a little bit and find a useful item or piece of equipment. And I remember in the story there were sections where Yuna could face off against other summoners to kind of prove her mettle, not just to the party and her fellow summoners, but to herself. And it was a cool way to progress the story, add some character development, and it was a fun way to get through that game despite it not having that traditional world map. But with that world map disappearing, it kind of became a bit of a sore spot for Yoshinori Kitase, where he then goes on to say, "We started off expressing this world that you could venture through this world map. That was how it was for Final Fantasy 1, but starting with 10, when we entered into this real-time 3D world, this is when the world map development ceased or halted to some degree. With 10, it was the style where a player chooses a point or an area that they would like to go to, and they travel from there. The feeling was that since it's real-time 3D, it's not quite possible to create this full world map anymore. Beyond 10, there is not really a clear world map within Final Fantasy, and this was the norm. I had assumed that this would be the same for Remake as well. So going into that, what director Naoki Hamaguchi noted was going back to our origins and restoring the fun of exploring this vast world map. That was a strong feeling. And again, Final Fantasy X was super linear, but once you got your airship, that's when the world map came back. But it wasn't that traditional world map where you see your tiny little character in this open world. You were locked to a screen where you had all of these different locations that you could visit. You could find the place you wanted to go, and boom, you were transported there. Pretty simple. And even though I really love that game and I don't really have an issue with the world map being kind of absent from 10, there is something so special about the previous Final Fantasies before 10 in regards to that open world map, because for a lot of the games you don't start in the open world automatically. For some games it takes you a while to build you up to that moment where you're finally entering the open world. And that was such a big part of Final Fantasy, because it's like, okay, what's this world gonna look like? What's the world map theme gonna sound like? How is this world going to change as I progress through the story? And in games like Final Fantasy VII, the further you get, the world map music actually changes. And the further you progress, these different creatures are starting to pop up within the world map, and you're seeing them for the first time. And I can't help but remember as a kid being super giddy and flying around in the high wind and suddenly seeing Ultima Weapon flying in the sky, being terrified to run into the thing, or seeing Ruby Weapon kind of poke its head out in the desert, or being in the ocean in the submarine and seeing this gigantic figure just kind of floating towards you, and it ends up being Emerald Weapon. So that exploration process of Final Fantasy is so vital, and it's one of the best parts of that game, getting to explore things for the first time. And back then, those world maps seemed large, but by today's standards, they're pretty small. But I think one of the reasons why they didn't do a proper world map for 10 is kind of what Kitase was going on there was, I don't know if it would have been possible for them to produce that type of world map in Final Fantasy X on a PlayStation 2. I think there may have just been too many hardware demands, or they probably would have had to have made some sort of sacrifices in terms of the graphics for that game to do a proper world map. So I don't know if it was a situation where you could have really had that world map and just go from place to place. I think it was better for the game's performance and the game's overall narrative to just kind of have these different level-based sections that just kind of transfer you as the story moves along. I think that's what was best for that game. Now, Tetsuya Nomura also chimes in on how that world map not being in those Final Fantasies just felt kind of weird. He says, "Ever since the world map disappeared, I really had this weird feeling. I always thought it was strange without a world map. I thought that you can't really have an RPG without a world map. Specifically for Final Fantasy VII, to fully experience this world, we must have a world map. We can't be without it," which is incredibly important. I think back to Final Fantasy VII and getting to that open world for the first time, you had this sense of, wow, we've left Midgar and we can go anywhere now. Which in reality, it's still pretty linear. You're running from Midgar to Calm and then going from Calm to the Chocobo Farm, so the locations themselves are very linear. But once you get further into that story and you get the Highwind and you can go pretty much anywhere, that sense of freedom and exploration was just so astounding. And I think that's something that they seem to be capturing with Rebirth, is that sense of freedom and kind of go where you want, talk to who you want, and do whatever you want. And it was important for 7 to have that world map and to have it return in Rebirth, because you look at the OG game, and once you move past the linearity stuff and it starts to open up, there are different sections of the map that just have different enemies. Or there's chocobo tracks that have different types of chocobos, and these hidden caves that you could go to, and of course breeding your chickens to reach that far off hidden island in the ocean that looks mysterious, that happens to hold the Knights of the Round Materia. So having that sense of freedom and exploration, it wasn't just a gameplay thing, it was a narrative thing, and they seem to be bringing that back with Rebirth. Now, after Final Fantasy X, there were a few Final Fantasies that I can recall off the top of my head that did return to the world map, and that was Final Fantasy 15. Now look, standard Final Fantasy 15 vanilla, not great. The Royal Edition, however, I will go full defense force on. I loved the Royal Edition of Final Fantasy 15, which did bring back the world map. Now, the world map in 15 was pretty large, but the world itself wasn't really all that populated. There was only a handful of towns that felt like they were significant, and you had a lot of gas stations, a lot of diners, and of course you had the different dungeons that you could explore, which were a lot of fun. But the lack of, having a populated world map in 15 didn't really bother me, because what made that game so great was Noctis and the Chocobros just doing things, driving around in the Regalia, running around, getting into battles, exploring dungeons. Even though the world itself was kind of empty, I didn't mind it because I just wanted to spend time with those characters and hear their conversations and see what kind of shenanigans we could get up to. Now for Final Fantasy 16, it's not technically an open world game, but there is a world map very similar to how it worked in Final Fantasy X. You kind of pick where you want to go and then boom, you're there. And then depending on where you are in the story or the area that you've gone to, you're either going to have one large hallway that you can explore, which in 16 it's not really worth going off the beaten path to explore, because you'll most likely just find a chest that's going to give you like 11 gil, and that's about it. All of the important chests you'll find on the path leading you to the next part of the story, so it's not really worth exploring. But some areas are big, some are small, and then some are just strictly for story stuff. You go there once and then you never return. So to have this world map return for 7 Rebirth, it just makes all the sense in the world, especially when you look at all of the things they're going to be including jam-packed into this game. Mini games, side quests, all the different monsters, all the new towns. There's going to be a ton of stuff for us to do in this game and explore, and having a world map just makes sense. And having a world map is kind of just expected when you have these open world type of games. I look back to Horizon Forbidden West and Ghost of Tsushima, and without a world map, it would be hard to navigate those areas and do things like fast travel or find specific towns and enemies. It, again, Rebirth, based on what Naoki Hamaguchi has said, is going to be a seamless game. There will be the different regions, but you can run from one end of the region to another end of the region, which is really cool. So to see them put a lot of emphasis and bring back things that some people might view as small, like a world map, is very reassuring. So with that being said, I am curious, Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think of the world map system within the world of Final Fantasy VII? Did you miss it when it left in Final Fantasy X? And just for fun, what is your personal favorite world to explore in Final Fantasy. Did you love Final Fantasy VII's world? Maybe 9, maybe it was 6. I'd love to hear in the comments down below. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.